No pressure with an introduction like that. Thanks a million, George.
Well, I like to tee them up. I like to tee them up there, Gerry. I'm not going to kind of preamble because we've got so much stuff to get through, and I think most people who are already tuned into this will know at least a little bit about you, especially with your book that's out this week. But what I want to do very briefly before we pile into some questions about your achievement with the 10 iron distance triathlons in 10 days, which is just phenomenal for anybody to even get their head around. We're going to hopefully try and do that today. But I want to kind of take you back, first of all, almost 20 years on a bit of a time travel back to the mid-1990s. And I want to kind of frame this up, and if it's okay with you, just explain a little bit about what your life was like, what old Gerry Duffy was like in the 90s, and the moment you decided that you were going to make some changes.
Okay, I guess, yeah, going back to the mid-1990s, as you say, 1995 probably was a significant year for me, albeit I didn't realize it at the time. I got a photograph taken. I was somebody that I'd left school in 1985, so this is kind of 10 years later. Once I left school, I stopped playing sport. I was very active in sport in school, but for the next 10 years, the only sport I played was golf. But I used to golf and play 18 holes of golf with probably eating 2 or 3 bars of chocolate and smoking 20, 30 cigarettes. So a bit of a contradiction to call myself a sportsman over that period of time. But I got a photograph taken in 1995 at the age of 27, and in the photograph, which ironically was with my sporting hero, Seve Ballesteros, the Spanish golfer, I saw myself for who I had become, which was somebody that was almost 5 stone heavier than 10 years before. A heavy smoker. With that photograph, in that photograph, I had at least 1, if not 2 packets of cigarettes in my jacket pocket. And it was a watershed moment. It was a seminal moment. I'm not saying that I suddenly said, pull back the curtains and said, I'm going to do A, B, C, D, E, but it did shock me into going back to exercise, something I really hadn't done in 10 years, and buying a pair of runners. I wasn't a runner really at all up to that in any way, shape or form, but I took up running in July of 1995 and started running 3 or 4 miles, 3 or 4 times a week, originally for 3 or 4 years, and then around the turn of the millennium, I kind of got up to, I was up to 5 or 8 or 10 miles at that stage, and from then I guess just started to raise the bar a tiny bit higher around the, the early kind of noughties, and it was only years later I kind of got into the more extreme stuff, I guess.
And was there a moment when you decided, I mean, presumably in the 90s where you saw that photograph, you didn't think, right, I'm going to run 32 marathons in 32 days, which is another of your amazing feats of endurance. You didn't think that, you just thought, right, I'm just going to get some runners on, and I'm just going to get out there and make some positive changes.
Yeah, I think, and I know anybody that's listening or watching to this will include yourself, George, because I know you speak of it, is that the benefits of running does, apart from the physical benefits to our body, it also unlocks, or certainly with me, unlocks inside of my brain, to just, I guess, endorphins and serotonin in the chemical in the brain that just makes you realize that, you derive happiness from it. And every time I went running, and it's never ever happened to me that I didn't get this, I got happier. I'm not saying it was always easy to go running in bad weather or to go early in the morning, which is what I love to do, but I always come back feeling better than when I leave. And that's what I got instantly. As I say, from 95 to about 2000 or 2001, I literally peaked at probably 7, 8, 9, 10 miles. The 32 marathons in 32 days, it did come years later, but at that stage, other benefits of what it did for me was it unlocked the mental part of my brain to challenge myself, to go back to college, to re-educate myself, to open my own business. And running, it wasn't in running, it was in something completely different, but running unlocked the mental part of my brain that challenged me to do it. And out of doing that, I got more self-confidence in myself, self-worth, self-esteem. I opened my own business in 2003. As part of that, one of the biggest fears I've ever overcome myself from a personal capacity is public speaking. And I had to do that in the business that I'd opened. But when I look back on it, it was running unlocked the mental part of my brain that gave me the confidence to do it. And so everything I've been lucky enough to do ever since, it all goes back to the day I took up running. And it's only years later I was able to give running the credit for that, because none of this was a master plan. As I say, first 5, 6, 7 years I got up to maybe 10 miles. I opened my own business. I overcame a huge public fear of speaking, and that gave me massive confidence in myself. I then took part in triathlons, and in 2004 my brother rang me and he said, will you do a triathlon? And I said to him as recently as 9 years ago, what's a triathlon? I didn't even know what it was.
Wow.
And he explained that it involves swimming, cycling and running. I said, for how long? And he said, for an hour and a half. And I said, well, I just didn't think I had the ability to do an hour and a half of endurance at that stage. And he said, well, it's a relay, so will you do one leg of it? So I agreed to do. I knew I could do the run, no problem at all. So I said, right, I'll do the swim. And I did a 15-minute swim, and I got these. I went and I did it just 3 miles from where I'm speaking right now. Was my first triathlon called Fighting Cancer Triathlon, and I did it as part of a relay team. I did the swim. I get out of the lake, and I felt like the most elite Olympic athlete ever after doing a 750-meter swim, and I was hooked instantly. And looking back now, that was probably one of my first competitive running or triathlon events. I'd done 5Ks and that kind of thing, but just I got instantly was hooked on it, and I said I want more of this, and that was literally in 2004, as long ago or as recently
as that. Yeah. Well, that's incredible to go from that to. I mean, I want to talk to you about the iron distance and Enduroman, which is kind of the name of the event. It was, I think, the Deca Enduroman. So, first of all, explain exactly what it is and where it is. Well, I have no idea even where it is. So, tell me a bit more about what you achieved a couple of years ago.
Well, I guess just to fast forward and to concentrate it, because I'd love people to be encouraged to realise that everything had a natural stepping stone to get me up there. You know, 6, 7 years ago, I said, right, I want to do a marathon. I'd never run a marathon, and so I ran a marathon. And then I said, right, I want to do an Ironman triathlon, and I signed up to do an Ironman triathlon. Then I did a second one of those, and then I got an idea out of a book to run consecutive marathons over consecutive days. And I got that idea in 2008. But I knew I wasn't nearly fit enough. So I said, right, I'll do it in 2 years' time. I knew if I wanted to run 32 marathons in 32 days, which is the challenge I came across or decided to do, which is one in every county on the island of Ireland, I said, I'm only at a 5 on the fitness ladder. And I knew that would need me, I would have to get to a 10. So I said, well, how do you get from 5 to 10? And I said, I need to serve another apprenticeship. So I went away for 1 year and I trained for a double iron distance triathlon, which was, I guess, the equivalent of swimming 320 lengths to a pool, cycling probably from, roughly I guess from maybe the centre of England, maybe Birmingham to Glasgow, something like that, and then running back-to-back marathons. Now, the distances I'm not as certain in terms of the UK, but roughly the swim, sorry, was 4.8 miles, the cycle was 224 miles, and the run was back-to-back marathons. And I went and I did that in a year later in 2009, then I trained for another year to do 32 marathons, 32 days, did that, lucky enough to finish that. And then I came across this, as you said, the Enduroman, which is a UK event. It was the first ever staging of a Deca iron distance triathlon in the UK. And I found that online, I researched it, I signed up for it, I trained for it, and then on the 3rd of June 2011, I arrived at the start line along with 19 other people.
Well, 19 started, but I believe 19 didn't finish, though, did they, Gerry?
No, 19 didn't finish, George. I guess to put the distances into context, and I have done this for the purposes of the book, so UK viewers of this might relate to these distances. It's the equivalent of approximately, now I do say approximately, swimming across the English Channel and then cycling from approximately Le Havre in the northern part of France, right down through France, and keep going until you get roughly halfway down Italy on a bike. And then you run from roughly halfway down the Italian coastline right down to the very, very bottom. So it's a swim of 24 miles, cycle of, and it's interesting your reaction, which is a reaction we get quite a lot, but so the swim is 24. Swim is 24 miles, the cycle is 1,160 miles, and the run was 262 miles. And as I said, it was 19 of us started on the 3rd of June. So each day we had to swim 2.4 miles, we cycle 116 miles, and we had to run a full marathon each evening on a 1 mile loop. And the first
1
day,
mile loop, so just round and round. That's how it was.
Yeah, it was. It was all set in a place called Avon Turle, a fabulous place, activity centre down in the very south of England near Bournemouth, in the New Forest. People might be familiar with the New Forest.
Yeah, yeah.
So we just swim in a very small lake, 13 laps each morning, which was 2.5 miles. We then had to cycle an 11.6 mile loop on the cycle route. So that was 116 miles a day. And then each evening we'd run just a fraction over a mile of a loop on a 1 mile loop around the forest each evening. So that was the exam paper that we had to sit each day.
And so you said it in the morning, then in the afternoon, and then in the evening. Did you like finish the swim and then you had a bit of time, a bit of a break? Because I know you were averaging around 16 hours, weren't you, for each of your iron distance each day? How did it work out logistically?
Yeah, logistically, it was superbly organised. I will say that from the beginning. There was a professional organising company that organised it. The logistics were the clock. We did 22-hour cut-off each day, and I must confess, George, that before I went there, I struggled to comprehend how it might take you 22 hours to do a single iron distance, but I hadn't, I guess, focused on the fact that we were doing this every day for hopefully for 10 days. The first day I budgeted for about 13 hours, which would have been, you know, it would have been a time that it was comfortable doing, thinking of the bigger picture of having to do this for 9 more days. But the first day actually took me over 14 and a half hours because I hadn't factored in the terrain of the course. It was quite hilly. Oh. And the fact that we were on loops, it meant that we were doing hills on a regular basis. The challenge each day was, you know, my strategy was to try and finish each day as quickly as possible, but obviously pacing to finish 10 days, not one. Whereas other competitors took their time at various aspects to get out of the lake and go into the marquee and sit down for 20 minutes, have a meal, and then get out on the bike and stop 2 or 3 times. But my strategy generally was to just eat as quickly as possible, just to get each section done as quickly as possible. And the 15 or 20 minute breaks that other competitors was part of their strategy. I said, well, if I can just keep going and just get one continuous bout of sleep each night, that might give me an extra hour or maybe even 2 hours each night that I figured one long bout of sleep might be worth a multitude of shorter siestas during the day, if that makes sense. So that was my strategy. But each night, the first night finished just before 9 o'clock. It was probably 10 o'clock before I got to sleep, but we were back up at 4:30 to do it all over again.
I mean, a lot of strategy, like you said. I mean, you're not exactly racing each other, but everyone will go into it with a different strategy. One of the questions that I have for you is about the training, and you mentioned a moment ago that before you did the 32 marathons in 32 days, you went off and you served another apprenticeship. I really like that idea of doing an apprenticeship and getting yourself ready to take on a big challenge like that. But how do you prepare for something like that? And then what makes you then think, okay, well, I need to sleep in this block instead of shorter little blocks? What kind of training did you do, volume and intensity wise?
Well, I guess it's interesting, and I know a lot of the people that would be, you know, love what you do. It's simply I guess like running a marathon. If you've never ran before, and somebody says I'm going to run a marathon, I would hugely encourage them, and I know you do as well, to go and serve apprenticeships of 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons. So what I did when I decided I was going to do this, the first thing I went into my head and I said, okay, what have you already achieved? Why do you think, you know, if you devote another year of training to this, why do you think you can do it? And I looked back on all the marathons I'd done, the Ironmans I'd done, the double iron distance triathlon that I'd done, and the 32 marathons, the 32 days had given me a huge wealth of experience in the legs in terms of endurance and in the brain as well, in terms of learnings that I got. So that's where I went to. You know, when I did my first Ironman, I probably did about 13 or 14 hours of training in a week. When I did the double iron distance, I was up to about 17 or 18 or 19 hours of training in an average week. But I looked at the kind of distances that I'd done on the bike, which was 6, 7, 8 hour cycles. And then I said, right, just bring it up to another level. But I also factored in things like, food. I'd learned is so important. In the 32 marathons in 32 days, my running partner, there was another guy doing it with me. And it was one day we both got our food wrong. And the next day we paid a big penalty. And that was a huge learning for me, to realize that whether we give it credit for it or not, our bodies are paying attention to everything. Because the next day, both of us hit a bit of a stumbling block at the exact same mile, and we realized we both missed the same meal the day before. I'm a firm believer. Right?
What was it that you did that caused that problem then? What was the mistake, the nutrition mistake?
We'd missed one particular meal. In the 32 marathons, there was a jigsaw puzzle every day that we used to literally create and navigate through and execute. And one of them was to eat particular meals at particular times. But the logistics on one particular marathon, because we were moving around to different locations every day, we missed one particular carbohydrate meal at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, both of us, just by coincidence. Just because of the logistics of not being able to find somewhere to get food. And we didn't even realize the significance of it on the day. It wasn't until mile 18 of the next day's marathon that both of us felt exhausted. And we started to rack our brains as to why. And when we looked back, we diagnosed that was the reason. And it was the only day it happened. So what that taught me 8, 9 months later was the importance of food. And I knew going into the Dakar Iron Distance event that so much of it was I had to eat normal food and in significant quantities, because we were burning 9,000-10,000 calories a day. And the organizers had briefed us in advance and said you need to be eating significant volume.
You were just telling me just before we got you rudely interrupted by a technical hitch there. What you learned, what that nutritional, wasn't quite a disaster, but it was a lesson. What that taught you, you kind of really only figured it out 8 or 9 months later. So if you want to pick up where you left off there.
Yeah, basically, I kind of knew, George, that every day I'd learned so many things about, I guess, how to raise the bar, because, what I've learned is the human body is capable, obviously, of doing far more things than we're given it credit for, but it's true, doing very simple things. And in the early stages of the Dakar Iron event, I was very conscious of things like at the finish line each night, which was usually kind of somewhere between 9 and 9 o'clock at midnight, somewhere in there. I used to walk down to the lake, which was in the opposite direction to the camper van, even though all I wanted to do was go to bed, but get into a sleeping bag. But I used to go back down to the lake and sit in the lake for 5 minutes just to cool down the muscles. I always went for a shower just to wash off the dirt. And even in the shower, even though the quads and the hamstrings were tightening up, I knew that I had to loosen them up. So I used to stretch every night, and I used to literally raise my knees up, even though I remember on the third night not being able to raise my right leg up, it was so sore. But I said, you're not leaving the shower until you can raise it up to 90 degrees, because if you can't do it now, you're definitely not going to do it after 4 or 5 hours of sleeping and lying in the same position. So I just stayed in the shower for whatever period of time it took to get that leg, to get the muscles back working again. Nutrition was vitally important. I used to have a smoothie. The crew used to give me a smoothie at the finish line, which is something I'd learned in the 30 marathons, a protein smoothie, which meant that the muscles were immediately being fed recovery, because we had to do it again in 5, 6, 7 hours time. And I knew that if I added up all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, sooner or later they would add up to something big. And I knew that every ounce of everything I did, whether it was swimming, cycling and running, resting, eating, stretching, cooling down the muscles, what I was eating, everything was a piece of the jigsaw puzzle that I had to get right if I was going to be successful. And they were just a multitude of learnings that I got over 15, 16 years, but I guess a lot of it in the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm not saying sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought. But what I'm trying to say is I firmly believe it's by doing simple things right on a consistent basis that we can do these, things that people might on the face of it think are impossible. But I did know that every ounce of everything I did every day would be put under the microscope and was being continually put under the microscope. every day we just got slower and slower and slower, but every day more and more people were coming out. And I must confess, up until the 7th day, I was lucky because so many other people got injuries because of, I guess, the repetitive nature of the challenge, the extremeness of it as well. And on the 7th day, I joined that list as well, as we all did over a period of time. But, you know, I guess at that stage you tap into the mindset because so much of the event was in the head as well. But certainly all of us, including the people that were lucky enough to finish, did all have to deal with a lot of different challenges along the way.
What did the other competitors do? You mentioned there about the different pieces of the jigsaw and the importance of stretching, cooling down, the protein shake on the line. Did the other competitors do the same sort of thing, or were you a bit more unique in that respect and able to bring and draw on your other experiences?
I guess it's hard for me to speak for anybody else. I'm pretty sure that year I was the only person to go back into the lake, but I guess I was luckier than most because I was finishing 2, 3, 4 hours earlier than a lot of people as well. Maybe that was partly a strategy insofar as I didn't stop for 20 minutes or 30 minutes as some people did to fully consume meals and to stop and rest, or maybe even catch a power nap 2 or 3 times during the day. I just figured that if I didn't do it during the day, 3 20-minute power naps would add up to a full 1 hour of sleep that I could tag on to 3 or 4 hours of sleep I was going to get anyway. And I figured that 5 hours of a continuous sleep rather than 3 hours and an hour here and 20 minutes here and there, if I got 5 hours continuous sleep, I felt that strategy would work best for me. So as a result, I was probably finishing earlier than most, and getting to bed that earlier. It also allowed me to go down to the lake. I used to get a massage every night from the crew, had this smoothie handed to me at the finish line. We had a camper van and the crew were preparing that there. And they're just things that had worked for me in the past, just things that I felt would work well for me, because nobody knows your body like yourself. And thankfully it did, because I was one of the lucky few that was still kind of going kind of 7 or 8 days after we started.
Gerry, you mentioned a minute ago as well that everybody got injured, including yourself. And you said that a lot of that kind of is in the head. And I should imagine this is a huge mind game. I've interviewed a couple of ultra runners recently as well, and they've said exactly the same thing. But this is something completely different because it's day in, day out for 10 straight days. So how did you? What kind of mindset did you have, and what specific tricks did you call upon to help you through and make it to the end?
It's interesting that you asked that question, because so much of this, you know, event is in the mind. I'm not saying you do obviously need to be, I guess, experienced, but also extremely well prepared. And I've done all of that. I peaked at 31 hours of training in a week. That was my longest week, where I did 4 half-Iron distance triathlons in 4 days, and another 6 or 7 hours at the end of that week. So it was a combination, a total of 31 hours. But in the first 7 days of the actual event itself, when I look back afterwards, I realized I'd done 96 hours of swimming, cycling and running. So there's only, you know, so much of that must be in the head. I definitely came up with some mental tricks, but I do remember on the 3rd day, and for the first 3 days, at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and bear in mind we started every morning at 6, we started to swim. So about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the first 3 days, I actually used to go into quite a low place, because one part of my brain was saying, Gerry, you've already swam 2.5 miles, we've already been cycling for 4 hours, you want us to cycle for another 4 hours, and you want us to run a marathon tonight, and you want to do it again tomorrow. And at this stage, we'd only less than 30% of the event done. And I used to go into a low place because I was, I guess, still doubting my ability, because so much of the magnitude of what we had to do was still ahead of us. And then at about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock on day 3, I came up with a mind trick that I've since used in other aspects of life, and that is, I realized this event was all about the number 10. It wasn't about 2, 3, 5, 6, it was about the number 10. I realized that all I was doing was passing through. This was day 3, and all I was doing was passing through. It was an immense challenge that I'd signed up for voluntarily. I said, you can't feel sorry for yourself, nobody's forcing you to be here. But all you're doing is passing through. This is meant to test you. It's an incredibly difficult and challenging event, and my research had told me that less than 70 people in the world had done an event like this, finished an event like this. And I said, you know, it's obviously incredibly challenging. If it wasn't, there would be thousands and thousands of people at the start line. There was only 20 people at the start line. This is just an extra test. And all you're doing is passing through, and you cannot get to 10 without passing through 3. You cannot get to 10 without passing through 6. And all you're doing is passing through. So that was one mental trick I used. I do remember on the end of the 6th night, ringing my partner Jacinta. I was very, very low because this is fast forward 3 days later and still even more tired and just drained of energy and physical and mental energy, just shattered on the 6th night. And I rang her, and she could sense this in my voice. And she was back home in Ireland, and she said, "How did your car registration finish?" And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Just tell me." And I said, 4321, they're the last 4 digits of my car registration. And she said, "Say it again." And I said, 4321. And she said, "See how fast you can say that." And I said, 4321. And she said, "Yeah, that's all you've left. 4 days, 3 days, 2 days, 1 day. See how quickly you can say it. Just tap into that psychology." And it's incredible what you harness on or focus in on or grab a hold of in this event or in any ultra event. And I'm sure many people that do whatever ultras are for them will empathize with this. I grasped a hold of that thought all the next day, and I repeated thousands of times, 4321, 4321, even every night. And things like, I remember on the 5th or 6th day, just on lap 16, suddenly just shouting out the number 16 for some unknown reason. But what it was just something to grab a hold of. And for the next 10 minutes, as I ran lap 16, I said it to myself out loud probably 50 or 100 times. And then I was on lap 17, and then I repeated that 100 times over the next 10 minutes out loud or in my head. And it was almost like I was just trying to tag a hold of something psychologically to tune into, I guess, because it's just, I guess it's amazing what you think of or where you go to. And even last Sunday, just 4 or 5 days ago, you and I were chatting about it earlier on, I was doing the Connemara Ultra. And the night before, I'd had a particular meal. And I remember looking at the menu and having a visualization at mile 30 last Sunday. I had the menu popped into my head. And I actually kept repeating words that I'd seen on the menu just to get me through, I think, 3 or 4 miles, and for no logical reason, George, other than it seemed to make sense at the time.
Gerry, you did the Connemara Marathon last weekend, which is a marathon and a half, isn't it? That's 46 miles, that one. Is it 40? No, what's the distance? 40 miles?
There was a half marathon, a full marathon, and an ultra marathon of 39.3 miles. And it's an event in the west of Ireland, stunning location, in the middle of nowhere. Just take your breath away. Just a wilderness, a beautiful wilderness. And over 3,000 people, as you know. And I think your sister lives not too far from there, so she knows the course well.
Does something like that still hold a challenge for you to rock up and do an ultra marathon like that, having done everything you've done, or are you looking for the next big challenge? I mean, where are you going from? Where can you go from here?
Well, what I've learned is this. You know, last week I'd done Connemara Ultra a year ago, and I hadn't done it before, so I was seeing the course for the first time. So this year, I set myself a challenge of beating my time last year. Last year took me 5 hours and 12 minutes, and this year I said, right, it'd be great to break 5 hours. And that hugely challenged me over the last 4 months because, you know, it's a big jump, and it's a tough marathon course with some big hills. And so I would derive as much satisfaction from that. I similarly would definitely I think an ultra can be anything. It's a personal ultra at the end of the day. It could be trying to beat 25 minutes in a 5K for somebody else. An ultra, I think, is always personal to the individual. And I think we must always respect that, because challenges are different things to different people. I'm not saying I wouldn't want to raise the bar in terms of doing something maybe more extreme than a decade, because the truth is I probably do. But last week, that event tested me as much as many other events have done in the past. And one thing I always tap into, and you ask me what mental, places I go to, a thing I learned many years ago was gratitude for the fact that I have my health. 4 or 5 years ago, I had a knee operation, and for 3 or 4 months, I doubted if I was ever going to run again. It's not that anything serious wrong, I actually didn't, but my mind was doubting, was I going to recover? And I said, Gerry, you haven't ran for 3 months. When you get back running, never forget this. And I wrote it down to always be grateful. And it's such a a simple trick, but such a respectful thing, I think, to do, and it jolts me out of ever feeling sorry for myself if I'm ever doubting myself or feeling sorry for myself at mile 35 of an ultra marathon. Like, in reality, Gerry, you're so lucky because you don't have to do this, you get to do this, and so many people are not that lucky, so how lucky am I?
Well, just being physically capable of going out there and doing any challenge, whatever it is, and you know, whether they get bigger and better and greater and more enormous and incredible, or, as you said, if you're focusing on beating times for shorter distances, if you can call an ultra marathon a shorter distance, I guess you're probably one of the few people who can. But Gerry, your book, which tells the story of all of this, pretty much everything we've talked about, TikTok 10, that's out this week, isn't it?
It is indeed, and I'm obviously a slower writer than I am a runner, because it tells the story of the Deca Iron Triathlon that I was lucky enough to do in the summer of 2011. It's taken me 20 months to kind of bring it to this stage. The truth is, it took me a year to recover from the event physically, because I got a couple of injuries in the event, and my immune system was absolutely shattered for 13 or 14 months afterwards. But in the book, I've just recreated that event. It's a single sports story that goes behind the scenes of that event. I explained to people in the first 20 or 30 pages how I arrived at I guess, the ambition of wanting to do it. I told my experience of the event, but also the experience of a number of other competitors, of what they went through. And I guess just an intimate behind-the-scenes account of what was involved, the logistics of the event, I guess the magnitude of it, because it is extreme, I guess, in every sense, and also the insight into the thought process or the experiences of 5 or 6 other people that were involved. And there was 3 of us lucky enough to finish it, and their stories are obviously told, but there's also 2 or 3 other stories of other competitors who weren't as lucky to finish it for a variety of different reasons. So I'd love to think it's a story, hopefully, that will interest people. I certainly took my time with it because I wanted to do it justice, and thankfully, as you say, it's literally just been in the shops for literally the last 24 hours. Here in Ireland, it's available right throughout the country, and it is available on Amazon. There'll be a Kindle version out in a couple of weeks, and it's also available on my own website, if I can.
Yes, no, go for it. It's GerryDuffyOnline.com, isn't it? Is your site?
That's it, GerryDuffyOnline.com.
Because I bought a copy a couple of days ago on Amazon, but for some reason it was the only copy, just one copy. So I'm not, and that was on Amazon.co.uk. So I'm sure that'll fill up again. The stores will fill up. But in the meantime, if somebody wants to get that book, I'll get the link below the video so people can see that anyway. But I'm looking forward to getting my copy and having a good read of that, Gerry, because it is an incredible story, and it's, you know, the word incredible is bandied around all too easily these days, and but certainly for you, that's a word where no other word really could take its place. So thank you again so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I look forward to hearing what other crazy challenges you can come up with next.
Well, I hope we're going to see you at the Dublin City Marathon again this year, are we, George?
Oh, well, I'm going to try and get over for the Expo. I mean, that was where I first met you, actually, was on the stage at the Expo, and I remember a few things about your talk there, which was quite soon after you did the 32 marathons in 32 days, and that was what your talk was on about there. So, yeah, I'm going to hopefully try and get over, so maybe we'll catch up and go for a beer or something at the time.
After the race.
After the race, yeah. Brilliant. Thanks again, Gerry. Much appreciated.
Thanks very much indeed.